There are moments in life that stay with you forever, not because they were long, not because they were perfect, but because they were so intense that they carved themselves into your memory like fire. For Demet Özdemir, that moment came when her eyes met his again. After years of silence, after months of pretending the past was behind them, one glance was all it took to bring everything rushing back. It wasn't a planned encounter. In fact, it felt almost cruelly accidental. A crowded event, too many cameras flashing, too many voices echoing in the background. And yet, in the middle of it all, the world seemed to fall silent. There he was. Can Yaman. The man who had once held her hand, who had once been her safe place, and who now stood only a few feet away, close enough to touch, but further than ever before. Their eyes locked, and in that instant, nothing else existed. Not the photographers, not the lights, not the whispers of the people around them. It was just the two of them, standing still in a sea of noise. And that's when the truth struck her like lightning. I knew it was too late. Too late for what? Too late for second chances, too late for unspoken words, too late for the kind of love that only comes once in a lifetime. Demet would later admit that she felt her chest tighten, her breath catch, as if her body itself understood that this was not just a casual meeting of old colleagues. This was a reminder of everything that had been lost, and everything that could never be reclaimed. In her heart, she had prepared for this day 1,000 times. She had told herself she would be strong, that she would smile politely, that she would not let the past take over. But the truth is, no one can prepare for a gaze like that. No one can prepare for the kind of silence that speaks louder than words, or the kind of pain that hides behind a single look. And so, while the world saw nothing more than a brief exchange of glances, Demet knew the truth. That moment was the end of something she had once hoped might still be alive. And it was the beginning of a confession she could no longer keep hidden. The truth is, no meeting ever happens in isolation. When Demet's eyes met Can's that night, it wasn't just about the present moment, it was about everything that had come before it. Their past was heavy, layered, complicated, and it came rushing back like a flood breaking through a dam. For outsiders, they were just two actors whose paths had once crossed. But for those who had followed their story closely, it was much more than that. Their connection had started on set, in front of the cameras, where fiction and reality blurred so effortlessly that even they sometimes struggled to tell them apart. What began as scripted lines and carefully choreographed moments had transformed into something undeniable, something raw and real. And when the camera stopped rolling, the emotions didn't fade. They lingered, powerful and magnetic, drawing them together again and again. But fame has a way of turning love into a battlefield. The same cameras that had once celebrated their chemistry became the very eyes that judged their every move. Every smile was dissected, every glance magnified, every silence filled with speculation. The world didn't just watch their story, it owned it. And under that kind of spotlight, even the strongest bond can begin to crack. Demet remembered the fights, not just with him, but with herself. She remembered the nights when she lay awake, wondering if their love was strong enough to survive the weight of expectation. And she remembered the way Can would sometimes shut down, building walls around his heart, leaving her standing on the outside, desperate to be let in. Their love was never ordinary, it was passionate, fiery, but also fragile. And when it finally broke, it didn't break quietly. The silence between them was deafening. Publicly, they went their separate ways. Privately, the wounds ran deep. Demet had told herself again and again that time would heal, that distance would give her the strength to move on. But deep inside, she knew the truth: some loves don't fade. They burn quietly, hidden under the ashes, waiting for the right spark to bring them back to life. That's why, when their eyes met again, the weight of all those memories came crashing down. She didn't just see the man in front of her. She saw the boyish smile that once melted her walls, the late-night phone calls that stretched until dawn, the promises whispered in the quiet of hotel rooms. She saw the laughter, the tears, the passion, and the pain. And most of all, she saw the one question that had haunted her for years: what if? But even as the memory swirled inside her, Demet felt something else, an unshakable certainty that it was too late. Too much had happened, too many scars had formed. The love that had once lifted them both now felt like a ghost, lingering in the shadows but unable to return to life. That's the cruel thing about the past, it doesn't let you go. It follows you into every new chapter, every new relationship, every new attempt at happiness. And as Demet stood there, facing him again, she realized she wasn't just carrying her own past, she was carrying his too. And that burden was heavier than words could ever describe. For years, people wondered why Demet never spoke openly about what had really happened between her and Can. Interview after interview, she carefully sidestepped the questions. She would smile, change the subject, or give vague, professional answers that left reporters unsatisfied and fans desperate for more. And yet, behind that carefully crafted silence, there was a truth she carried with her every single day. The truth was painful. It wasn't the kind of confession you could give lightly, because once it left your lips, it became real again. And for Demet, that reality was one she had spent years trying to escape. It was easier to smile in front of cameras than to admit that her heart still tightened every time she heard his name. Easier to talk about new projects, new beginnings, than to acknowledge that a part of her was still stuck in the past. Silence became her shield. By not speaking, she protected herself from judgment, from gossip, and most of all, from the possibility of reopening wounds that had never truly healed. She told herself that silence was strength, that forgetting was the only way forward. But deep down, she knew it wasn't true. Forgetting is impossible when your story has been written so deeply into who you are. Every time she scrolled through her phone and stumbled upon an old photo, she felt it. Every time she saw his face flash across a magazine cover, she felt it. Every time fans tagged her in clips of their old scenes together, she felt it. The world hadn't let go of them, and neither had she. There were nights when the silence became unbearable. Nights when she would sit alone in her apartment, staring at her phone, tempted to call him, to hear his voice again. But she never did. Her pride, her fear, and the certainty that it was too late always stopped her. She would close her eyes, take a deep breath, and bury the feeling once again beneath layers of silence. But silence has a way of speaking louder than words. And in her eyes, those who knew her best could always see the truth. Her friends noticed the way she stiffened whenever his name came up. Her family knew better than to ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. And her fans, her loyal fans, saw it in her interviews, in the way her smile never quite reached her eyes whenever the past was mentioned. And then came that night, when their eyes met again. The silence she had guarded so carefully for years shattered in an instant. Because in that moment, she realized that silence hadn't protected her, it had only delayed the inevitable. She couldn't hide from herself anymore. She couldn't deny the truth that lived inside her heart. Her silence, she admitted later, had never been about strength. It had been about fear. Fear of being judged, fear of being misunderstood, fear of admitting that she still carried him with her, even after all this time. And yet, when she finally confronted that fear, she discovered something unexpected: the weight of truth, even when it hurts, is lighter than the burden of silence. By confessing, by admitting that when their eyes met again, she knew it was too late, Demet wasn't just telling her story. She was freeing herself. She was giving a voice to the feelings she had tried to bury for so long. And in doing so, she gave the world a glimpse of her most vulnerable, most human side. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is not to stay silent, but to finally speak. It's strange how sometimes, entire conversations can be held without a single word being spoken. That night, when Demet and Can's eyes met across the crowded room, the silence between them was louder than the music, louder than the chatter of guests, louder than the clicking of cameras. In that silence lived years of unspoken feelings, regrets, and memories. To everyone else in the room, it was just a moment, two former colleagues, two celebrities acknowledging each other politely. But for Demet, it was as if time itself had stopped. In his gaze, she saw the reflection of her own past, the laughter they had once shared, the promises whispered in the dark, the tears shed when words were not enough. It all came back in an instant, as sharp and clear as if it had happened yesterday. She later admitted that it was almost unbearable. It was like looking into a mirror of everything I had tried to bury, she said. His eyes, once so familiar, carried the weight of questions neither of them had dared to ask. Did he still think of her? Did he regret the way things ended? Or was she the only one trapped in the cycle of what once was? But more powerful than the questions was the answer she already felt deep in her chest: it was too late. The glance was filled with recognition, yes, but also with distance. There was a barrier now, invisible but undeniable. They had once been each other's safe place, but that night, they were strangers carrying the same memories. Demet felt her heart clench as she realized something even harsher: sometimes love doesn't die in a dramatic explosion. Sometimes it fades quietly, leaving behind ghosts that only appear when your eyes meet again. And that ghost was standing between them, reminding her of everything they had lost. Her instinct was to look away, to break free from the intensity of that gaze. But she couldn't. Something stronger held her there, locked in a silent dialogue that words could never capture. And in those few seconds, she swore she could hear his voice, not literally, but in the way his eyes spoke. They seemed to say, "I remember too." Yet there was no smile, no gesture, no step forward. Just stillness. Just two people who had once been everything to each other, now bound by a truth they could not change. She wanted to move, to bridge the gap, to reach for him. But she didn't. Because in that moment, the reality of time, of choices, of distance crashed down on her. And so she stood there, frozen, letting the weight of it consume her. Later, she confessed, "That glance hurt more than any argument we ever had, because it told me everything without a single word. It was the glance of recognition without reconciliation, of love without possibility." It was a reminder that sometimes, the greatest tragedies of the heart are not the ones that end in anger, but the ones that end in silence. And as the world moved around them, as cameras flashed and conversations continued, Demet realized she had just lived through a moment that would haunt her forever. A glance that spoke louder than any confession, louder than any scream. A glance that told her the truth she had feared all along: it was too late. After that night, Demet tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. She smiled at the cameras, posed for photographs, gave interviews where she spoke about her latest projects. To the world, she was the same radiant star, confident, composed, untouchable. But inside, she was unraveling. Because the truth is, when her eyes met Can's again, something inside her broke open. All the walls she had built, all the silence she had wrapped around her heart, all the rehearsed lines she had told herself about being over it. They collapsed in an instant. She could no longer pretend. She could no longer lie to herself. Later, in a moment of rare honesty, she admitted, "When our eyes met again, I knew it was too late. Too late to fix what was broken. Too late to rebuild what had crumbled. Too late to turn back time and undo the choices that had led them here." That sentence carried more weight than an entire book of confessions. Because it wasn't just about losing him, it was about losing the chance to ever be what they once were. Time had moved forward, life had carried them in different directions, and though the feelings remained, the path back to each other had disappeared. Demet described it as a cruel kind of clarity. For years, she had carried the what-ifs like an anchor. What if she had fought harder? What if he had stayed? What if they had chosen differently? But in that moment, she realized there were no more what-ifs. Only reality. Only a silence between two people who once had everything, and now had nothing. And yet, within that pain, there was also a strange kind of peace. Because knowing it was too late freed her from the endless cycle of wondering. The chapter was closed, not in the way she had once dreamed, not with reconciliation or forgiveness, but closed nonetheless. And so, she spoke her truth. Not in front of a crowd, not in a press conference, not as a carefully crafted statement. But as a raw, vulnerable confession: "I knew it was too late." Her words were simple, but they carried a storm within them. A storm of love and loss, of longing and regret. A storm that reminded us all of the fragility of time and the cruelty of fate. Because sometimes, the most painful truths are not the ones shouted in anger, but the ones whispered in silence. Sometimes, the hardest goodbyes are not spoken out loud, but lived through a single glance. For Demet Özdemir, that glance was both an ending and a beginning. The ending of a love story the world had adored, and the beginning of a new chapter where she could finally face her truth without fear. The truth that love, no matter how deep, does not always survive. The truth that silence can protect you, but it can never heal you. And the truth that sometimes, when your eyes meet again, it's already too late. But perhaps the most powerful part of Demet's confession is not its sadness, but its honesty. Because in that honesty, countless people saw themselves, their own regrets, their own missed chances, their own too late moments. And that is why her truth matters. Her story is not just about Can Yaman. It's about the universal ache of love lost, about the haunting reality that some chapters end before we're ready to let them go. And in the end, maybe that is the greatest gift she could give her fans, not a fairy tale, not a perfect ending, but the courage to admit that some endings hurt, and that's what makes them real.